Requiem aeterna.
Hi there, this is Brent.
And this is Amanda.
We are the Unreliable Narrators.
Here to talk about the strangeness, the mystery, and the wonder of Gene Wolfe's prose.
What is time?
What is memory?
What is a person?
Is this reality?
Where are we?
Do we exist?
Have you ever considered that all your choices were of what brought you right here to this very moment?
Episode number 27, Bibliomen, 20 Characters Waiting for a Book. First publication in a Cheap Street limited edition, 1984, then republished in an expanded version by Broken Mirrors Press, October 1995. And of course, this is the Broken Mirrors Press edition we're discussing today. And so it's not 20 characters waiting for a book, it's 22 characters waiting for a book because the expanded version has 2 additional Bibliomen in it.
So there's a few things I'd like to discuss, Amanda, before we get to the characters.
Oh, you want to talk before we talk?
Yeah.
Okay, what do you want to talk about?
2 things. So there's cover art.
Yes.
So the cover art is by Stephen Alcorn, and I would describe it as a combination of a medieval scribe at their desk, an angel that is a wheel, that is also a printing dress drum, with a dove descending, and then there's a waxing crescent moon top right, and that's the sliver of the moon growing after a new moon. And then they're printing out a woman.
Yeah, an image of a woman seems to be coming off of the press.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on that cover.
Yes.
I like it, but I don't really know what to make of it because it's the spinning of a wheel that's an angel and it's outputting people.
Yeah, it's a bit surreal. You've got symbolism working in it, but it's just not sure to what end or to what purpose here. I mean, it's definitely, these are, what is it, biblically accurate angels,
Yeah.
wheels within wheels kind of thing. But it does have a feel of a medieval manuscript, the stylization, even though the image itself doesn't seem to be.
Yeah. And I guess while we're talking about illustrations, so George Barr, he did the illustrations on the Cheap Street edition. This one has illustrations by Ian Miller, and these are completely different. So George Barr did little medallions above the names.
Yes. And these are full page illustrations at the beginning of each story.
Yeah, not everyone has them, but there's quite a few.
Yeah, and stylistically quite different.
Yes.
Basically, if you don't have a copy of both texts, you should try to find the images if you can, because they are interesting and there's some variety here.
Yeah. And then we have one copy of this
in front of us.
Yeah, so on the back.
Oh, yes, the back of the copy?
Yeah. This isn't a full text, but there's a bit of a, I'm not going to use the term hidden bibliomen here, but there's a quote.
Although conversationally, he did use the term hidden bibliomen, just FYI.
That was before we started recording.
Before recording.
So there's a quote on the back.
Yeah, there is. Let's see. It says, "Books are wells of living water, golden urns in which manna is laid up, or rather, indeed, honeycombs, udders most copiously yielding the milk of life, storerooms ever full." And that quote is attributed to Richard de Bury, Bishop of Durham, 14th century. So what is it about this quote that is so interesting?
So this was an actual person.
Yes.
So he lived from 1287 to 1345. And that quote is from a book that he wrote, and it's Bibliomen. And it's a word that he coined from the Greek.
So like lover of books.
Yeah.
Yeah, or bibliophile, just in reverse order.
Uh-huh. And it's a book that it's somewhat funny in the sense he wrote it in justification for all the money he was spending to build the church's library.
Yes.
And there's a quote in there. I read through sections of it. There's a quote where it says, "The same man cannot love both gold and books." So there's sections in there that are written from the perspective of a book, but then there's also how to go about buying books, how you would lend books out to people. And he says, don't lend them out unless you know it's somebody that's trustworthy.
This is a reliable narration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people have described it, and I agree with this assessment, but it's kind of like erotic poetry to a book.
Okay.
Or books as a form. That's where you get these golden urns with mannas laid up and
honeycombs.
Yeah.
And, excuse me, copious udders.
Yeah, there is that. So, yep.
Okay.
It's a Wolfe book, so there's a boob joke in there.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
But where this kind of becomes a Bibliomen theme is there is some controversy. Did the bishop write this book? So he had a chaplain. And so his chaplain may have actually wrote it later using his name. And so there is some scholarly back and forth about.
Okay, that's really interesting because in Wolfe-related, trivia, my understanding is that Wolfe agreed, along with, there are many people who think that C.S. Lewis's literary executor, who I believe was an ordained minister, so Dan Knight called him the Good Reverend. There's well-known controversy over whether or not he wrote some things and passed them off as lost manuscripts of C.S. Lewis's. And again, reportedly, Wolfe agreed with the critics that thought that Walter Hooper was doing this.
Yeah.
So for him to quote from a book that has that same question about its origin, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it just keeps folding in on itself.
Well, and I mean, whether or not that particular connection was explicit to Wolfe or not, we have lots of misattributed texts throughout Bibliomen. So this seems a given that he intended that.
I don't know if Wolfe specifically selected the quote for the back. However, there's enough of the in-jokes and connections that it seemed like a purposely chosen quote.
Yeah, not just a randomly, hey, books are cool kind of joke. Yes. I think the connections make sense there. All right, so shall we talk about our last two Bibliomen?
Yeah.
All right, so Seaman is the title of Bibliomen number 21. Interesting little story, short little story, like all of these. Just basic summary. We have a character, Glenville Neal, born in London, begins to establish his fame in the fiercely competitive graphic novel field with what's called the Smoke and Mirrors sequence that is published in a Brighton magazine. Then he moves to the U.S., to a place in Wisconsin, where he lives with his wife and continues work on the Smoke and Mirrors sequence. And then there's a decline of popularity and some interesting things right at the end. So I don't want to tell too much about the end before we start unpacking this a bit. But Glenville Neal seems to be our main character here.
Yeah. I mean, this maybe is just too obvious to even say, but I think Glenville Neal is Neil Gaiman.
Okay. Because of it's Neil, but then also G.
Yeah. The name, and then he's working in comics.
Yes. Maybe is or is inspired by. Yeah. And then so he draws Smoke and Mirrors, establishing his fame in the fiercely competitive graphic novel field. Smoke, the Lord of Obscurity, was in effect a demigod, though not so called, ruling Earth from a vast palace outside time and space, from which he set forth at the beginning of every episode to correct or eliminate historical abnormalities and anachronisms, occasionally assisted, but more often opposed by his consort, Mirrors, the Lady of Illusion. This makes me wish hope that there are such characters out there in the graphic novel world, and I just don't know about them because I don't read very many graphic novels.
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with the Sandman
I am
series.
not at all familiar, although I've been encouraged to read them. I haven't started yet. I haven't bought a copy yet. And so,
Yeah, I've just not been super into graphic novels. A man only has so much time, and books definitely pack my time.
yeah, I don't gravitate toward graphic novels because I like to read. And so there isn't enough text to hold my interest. And so I've never felt the appeal of them, the delight in the artwork and the pictures that people enjoy so much. That just isn't as much to my taste. Although this last year I did read Alan Moore's Watchmen and found it quite interesting and an enjoyable thing to read. But I wouldn't have done that without the push of Susanna Clarke talking about what a transformative experience it was for her to read Watchmen. And I read it and I enjoyed it. It wasn't as profound an experience for me as she narrated for herself, but I'm glad I did. So that's why I think Sandman is probably next on my list, because when I was talking to someone about it, they said, okay, well, Watchmen is one thing, but also you need to read some of these other things. So,
yeah.
Anyway, so that description of smoke and mirrors, they sound like very interesting characters. And that fertile imagination of Wolfe's that he came up with what sound like very intriguing characters.
Yeah. I don't know how to say this. It's
Nabagamon?
Nabagamon?
I'm not sure. If we were from Wisconsin, maybe we would know how to pronounce it. But
yeah, well, actual lake south of the Great Lakes, famously known for the world's largest ball of twine.
Hey, I found that factoid also.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, but that would have been a bit later than Wolfe publishing this. So,
yeah, I also looked for houses for sale in Lake Nabagamon, and there were no haunted mansions. So Neil immigrates to the United States in 1986 and settles down in Lake Nabagamon. Now, it's spelled here Wisconsin, which I'm assuming is a typo, but I couldn't figure out anything.
I'm glad you brought that up. I missed that.
Oh, okay.
I would assume it's a typo too, but
you just never quite know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just seemed like a misspelling of Wisconsin. And he settles down there with his wife, Mary Neal. And then he tells her that he has been seeing mirrors, the Lady of Illusion, in their capacious home. Well, I mean, it was described as a haunted Victorian mansion.
Yeah, so now we have a fictional character peeking into the real world.
Yes. And okay, I think that I like that narratively, but I also, you said Glenville Neal seems possibly to be Neil Gaiman or based on Neil Gaiman. In the interview we did with Dan Knight, he talks about moving into a haunted Victorian rectory. Now, this was in Canada, not in Wisconsin, but that's fairly close. And so I felt like his life experience, and he describes the haunting, it seems to be a little overlap here. So Wolfe pulling from multiple friends' experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Mirrors, the Lady of Illusion, has been appearing in their home. And I love this sentence. Accustomed to her husband's frequently profitable eccentricities, Mary Neal gave little attention to this assertion.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then apparently he also sees smoke in the house. And he tells his mother that he has to draw him to get him to stop watching me.
Well, and that makes sense because the smoke and mirrors are often at odds in his stories. You have Mir doing one thing and the implication being like, hey, aren't you supposed to be working? You should be being creative.
So stop getting distracted and get back to work. Yeah. And then, okay, this is fantastic. Sorry. As Neil's mental health declined, so did his circulation. His creator, B.J. Solomon, achieved only a minor and temporary reversal of the downward tendency by having Mary Neal divorce him. What?
Well, we're a character within a character.
I know. I mean, because the first time I read that sentence, I just mentally substituted editor for creator and assumed that, oh, here we have an over-meddling editor.
Yeah.
And then when I went back and read it, oh, no, his creator. All right. Neil is a character in B.J. Solomon's story and apparently is losing control of his character because despite having the wife divorce him, which temporarily boosts a fictional character's creativity of fictional characters, his mental health continues to decline. So then what is it? This is the last sentence of the story. During the period August 1993 to June 1994, Neil was metamorphosed, becoming Seaman, a righter of wrongs and avenger of injustices, residing beneath a vast dome of glass under Lake Superior.
I know you already mentioned you don't know a lot about comics, but the only thing I was thinking when I read that line, have you ever heard of the Midwest Avengers?
I have not.
Okay.
Tell me about them.
Well, it's been a long time since I've seen any of, but they were essentially a misfit band of superheroes that they were the Midwest Avengers and they had...
So low rent Avengers?
Yeah, it's essentially like the Mystery Men of the Avengers. Like there's...
Another reference I don't get.
Okay. That was a movie.
I'm sorry.
Big Bertha is one of the characters, and she can change her weight. And so she moonlights as a supermodel, but she actually is like a very large woman. And so she can punch through walls and do all sorts of things. And Deadpool ends up dating her at one point.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and so it's a collection of superheroes that are of questionable... They usually end up doing silly things. So I think Squirrel Girl was part of the Midwest.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
okay.
So she can command the loyalty of squirrels.
Well, that would be a good power to have. There are lots of squirrels in the world.
Okay. The fact that he became a superhero right here at the end, it was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
I do have a question along that, though.
Okay.
Given there's been at least 2 or 3 of these short stories that it's like, the cleaning the gun sight with his teeth accident, and I forget there was another one.
Cleaning the front side of his 357 with his teeth.
Yeah. Given the number of dark humor jokes in here, do you think there's anything about him residing on the bottom of Lake Superior?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe this is just because another book we read recently had a lot about dead bodies in the Great Lakes. That was Lee Finger's latest. Definitely pick it up and read it. It's far better than that brief little vignette would indicate. But yeah, it seemed like the character couldn't be worked with or couldn't handle the stresses and pressures of the creative life, which seems then projection of the writer. And then, it seems like an end because it's not a meaningful narrative path. Like, it would be really hard to write a graphic novel author who then himself becomes a superhero in a convincing way. So it seems like the destruction of the character.
So this isn't Condor Man?
Again, another reference I'm not getting. I hope the audience is entertained.
Yeah, I guess if you like kind of crappy, obscure movies about an author, he wants all his comic book character stuff to be as accurate as possible, so he becomes...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's probably not a very good story.
It's forgettable.
Okay. You remembered it.
I remember it because I begged and begged to watch it.
Oh. So then your disappointment in it, how many of those experiences are there in life?
Too many.
Yeah. This is the only thing I want. Oh, this is awful.
Yeah. Okay, I was just wondering because he resides at the bottom of the lake now, and okay. Because I read it and then kind of had to do a double take when I was thinking about it, and I was like, that may not be as tearful as an ending as my initial impression was.
That makes sense.
But yeah, you're correct. it's like the last sentence. There's kind of a, oh yeah, by the way, now he's doing this other thing.
Yeah. So an abrupt end for Bibliomen number 21.
I was going to say, so Gaiman and Wolfe did Walking Tour of the Shambles. They collaborated on.
Yes.
They did some other stuff, like they used to do nonfiction articles together and that type of stuff. So that's one reason why I was, other than the name, it's like they were in each other's orbit.
Oh, yeah. And there's a photo of the two of them that floats around the internet and maybe appeared at cons together, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Did you have anything else to say about Seaman?
No, I just like the creation of Smoke and Mirrors as characters. They seem really interesting. I would read that graphic novel, or at least I'd give it a try if it really existed. All right, so that takes us to our final Biblioman, Captain Roy. What do you think about the story?
This one, so I liked Captain Roy a bit better than Seaman. So Captain Roy, he's in the military, and then
he's in the academic world as a professor of American literature.
Yeah, and so he retires and gets a boat and turns it into a library.
Yes, a floating library. And it seems to be sort of a honor system exchange floating library where people can trade books or take books and trade produce or just take stuff.
Yeah. So just the idea of what he was doing, I found that appealing.
Oh, for sure.
And I say this knowing nothing how to sail a boat.
Right.
Or even I've been out on the ocean a bit, but I am...
Well, and that's not even the steepest difficulty for you. I think the steepest difficulty would be having books around water.
Yeah.
If you don't know, Unreliable Brent, and to a similar, although somewhat lesser extent, Unreliable Amanda, are a bit obsessive about the care of their books.
That is a true statement.
Yes. And so, I mean, even just the fact that we live in a dry climate, there are lots of reasons to move to a coastal climate. Lots of reasons that I think either of us would consider very, very important, but not having to run a dehumidifier to protect our books from excess moisture is a good reason to stay here in the high desert.
Yep. I agree with that.
It is an incredibly appealing idea, although I don't think it would be the kind of thing that either of us could manage to do, even apart from the sailing things. Yeah, so there are lots of interesting details here. I did a double take reading the opening lines because character graduates with a Master of Arts at the age of 12.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, born January 15th, 1928, and then graduates Master of Arts from Dakota State. I don't know how rigorous this program was, in 1940. And then enters the U.S. Navy in 1941, so at the ripe old age of 13. So he's in the Navy from the ages of 13 to 18.
I kind of assumed he was just drafted because he was no longer in school.
Right, so it's just like, oh, you've graduated from college, now... Yeah, so boy genius.
Yeah, boy genius who then goes into World War II.
And then goes on to get another master's degree after getting out of the Navy, and then a doctorate, and then teaches American literature at Western Washington University until his retirement in 1993. Okay, I love the list of his academic publications.
Yeah.
Poultry as Symbolism in 19th Century American Literature. Tea Time Talk in the Novels of Louisa May Alcott. Washing as a Euphemism in the works of Jack London, and a postmodernist critic views the antebellum Middle West.
I would read these books.
Oh, me too.
So I was laughing. The other thing, too, is washing as a euphemism in the works of Jack London. I was just thinking about when you were in the Melville.
Oh, yes, in the Melville class.
Yeah.
What about when I was in the Melville class, Brent?
They were trying to turn something about building a fire into a euphemism, and it turns out they were just importing our modern understanding of words back into the...
Yeah. So in Taipei, which actually, sorry, minor digression here on Melville, no one asked for, but I didn't go to graduate school for nothing. So Taipei was one of Herman Melville's early works. It actually was the book that put him on the literary map at the time. So although Melville died in obscurity, he was a literary sex symbol for quite a while. When he got married and left on his honeymoon, there was a crowd of women that was chasing the train as they were leaving.
What? I feel like you're pulling my leg.
No, I am not pulling your leg. This is historical event reported in the newspaper.
Is this what Ursula K. Le Guin means when she says Wolfe is our Melville?
Oh my goodness. Maybe it's what Wolfe wished she had meant. I don't know. Something about copious udders. Anyway, so Herman Melville, on the reputation from Taipei. So he actually worked as a sailor. He spent a period of time, about 6 months, on a South Pacific island. He turned those experiences into the novel Taipei. It apparently for the 19th century is a very sexy novel because you have stranded sailors and they are with a tribal group who doesn't wear a lot of clothing. There are a number of practices, including the diplomatic deployment of sexuality in certain tribal groups.
Mm-hmm.
And he narrates them in a very circumspect, very Victorian kind of way, but it's there in the text. So he's welcomed in a number of ways. He describes the young woman who is his regular companion standing up and holding her robe out as a sail. And it's pretty easy to deduce from that narrative that she is then in the nude as she's holding up this cloth as a sail while they're sailing about on a little lake. There are a number of things here that, it's a sexy story by Victorian standards.
Yeah.
Which are, ankles are sexy. But then there is a fairly extended scene where he and the other sailor, they've let their fire go out and they're trying to start the fire using the Polynesian fire plow, which is, it's kind of like Boy Scouts, but instead of a stick that you spin using either a bow or your hands, it's a stick that you push back and forth in a small groove. And so in this graduate class, extensive argument about whether or not this is an extended, sublimated description of the two men masturbating together. Well, okay, hypothetically possible, but I had to do a presentation. We all had to do presentations. So I decided to do a presentation on whether or not this interpretation was correct. And it wasn't just people in the class. This is also in the academic literature. Is the description of the fire plow sublimated masturbation? Because you couldn't use that word or even describe that act in any literature at the time. Basically, no, it's not.
All that to build up that no, it isn't.
So we had a guy come in and speak to the class, and he had retired to Boise as an anthropologist who had specialized in the South Pacific. So he was, maybe still is, one of the world experts on Polynesian anthropology. And so he shared with us quite a lot. There's a whole academic debate over whether or not cannibalism is just a colonial interpretation or if they called them cannibals and it was part of the colonial oppression to describe them as cannibals. He's like, no, I've met lots of people who talked to me about how much they missed eating human meat. And apparently the hand is extremely delicious. And then when it came to this fire plow interpretation, he's like, no, if you've ever tried to start a fire using a fire plow, this is a step-by-step, extremely accurate physical description of the exertion required. And so if you just want to know how to use a fire plow, you could read Melville's narration of it. And if you had the pieces in front of you, you could start a fire based on this accurate description. Then the classmates, well, but that doesn't mean he wasn't also describing masturbation. And so the interpretation in the academic literature basically turns on the use of the word climax. So the climax of his efforts. And so I did some research on the colloquial use and the euphemistic use of the word climax. And apparently its use as a euphemism for orgasm was invented by a very early 20th century author of sex manuals. So she was using a neutral word in order to describe in a clinical way human sexuality that was palatable for a wider audience. Anyway, long digression on Melville. I hope that enlightened someone, and I hope this doesn't get us tagged explicit for my use of
Well, I
this
hope
language.
not to, but it's Melville, and I think we need to get to Melville someday.
Probably.
Probably going to be years down the road, but
Wait, you mean in the podcast?
in the podcast.
Yes, because Wolfe is our Melville. I think Le Guin is right on so many levels there, but that will require some rereading of Melville and discussion.
Yeah. I'm fairly sure Wolfe was aware of these conversations around Melville, and then there's the joke in there.
Yes, and actually, it's connected in another way.
Oh, how's that?
He names his ship the Bounty. And if everybody knows that mutiny on the Bounty, Tahitian, so you've got a disaffected British crew, they take aboard Tahitian women, Captain Bligh is put off the ship and they mutiny, and then they find an island to live on with these Tahitian women. And so that seems to be a pretty clear connection to me, that he's definitely calling forth that.
No, I'd agree with that. I was going to say his ship was originally named the Appaloosa, too. So
Yes.
I just put a note on there because that's a breed of horse that's associated with Nez Perce Indians.
Yes, it's also the Idaho State horse.
Incidentally, there's also, you can get a license plate with the horse on it.
You can, if you want to.
Yeah. If you've
also,
seen
you can go find an Appaloosa and ride it if you want to.
Yeah. Yes, you could. I was going to say, if you've seen a Western, you've seen it. It's the spotted horse.
Yes.
And then they have their hooves have stripes on them.
Yeah. And the aesthetic ideal of the Appaloosa is mostly a solid color, but they have the spotted, what they call a blanket across their rump.
Mm-hmm.
And because, as with all animals that are bred for a particular physical characteristic, most Appaloosas are not actually terribly trainable unless you get one that's outcrossed or one that is just spotted all over and doesn't have that very specific coloration, because then they have better genetic diversity and less nervousness and skittishness.
I don't know if it adds anything to the story, but the boat used to be the Appaloosa. Then he renamed it to the Bounty.
Yeah, so it seems like our character, Captain Roy, a Polynesian reference, although he's sailing on the Pacific coast. Then, spoilers, which this podcast is full of, the Bounty capsizes and sinks.
I like how he's organizing the books. He's separating them out, port and starboard, and between the ones he likes and the ones he doesn't.
And the indication here is that now the ship is unbalanced.
Yeah. And it's Avram Davidson's
Mutiny in Space.
That he picks up off the shelf. And that's, I was going to say the straw, but I guess that's the book that broke the bounty, capsized the bounty.
The book that capsized the bounty.
Yeah. So, and then his body's never recovered.
No, it's gone down in the ocean.
Mm-hmm. Just a little aside here with Avram Davidson. So the Mutiny in Space, that is an actual book. It's a novel that he wrote. And I think that ties back in with the bounty for the name, as you already brought up. Davidson's known more for his short stories, though. His novels are not as widely regarded. So Wolfe wrote a tribute. So there's the Avram Davidson Treasury, and there's a story in there, Polly Charms, the Sleeping Woman. Wolfe wrote the introduction to it, and incidentally, Harlan Ellison wrote the afterword. And actually, I think Harlan Ellison's afterword does a lot to humanize Harlan Ellison.
Something that Harlan Ellison may need.
Yeah. And then Wolfe has two versions of an essay floating around. It's The Fish Unturned and The Unturned Fish, which they're about Davidson. And then I'm fairly certain, but there's a short story, Bed and Breakfast, where there's a short little man who served in the Navy and the Marines, and the narrator calls him out as being braver than you would think. And I'm pretty sure that's Wolfe inserted Avram Davison in his short story, Bed and Breakfast, because he talks about him in these essays in similar ways.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually haven't read the
Mutiny in Space?
Yeah, Mutiny in Space. I do have a copy of it, but just
because time is limited and you haven't been able to read every single book?
Exactly.
Okay.
But if you enjoy Wolfe, I would say try Avram Davidson. He was Jewish most of his life, and so he has a different flair and texture and the spiritual concerns. So similar spiritual concerns as Wolfe, but also the interpretations of those concerns are slightly different. So if you're at all interested in that type of spiritual and metaphysical stuff.
This is probably not fair to put you this much on the spot, but I think some listeners might find it helpful just to like a thumbnail sketch of what you're talking about with that, because I think for people within the Catholic tradition or with a deep familiarity with the Catholic tradition, read Wolfe, you can recognize, there are so many things that are so obviously deeply enriched by the Catholic tradition. And in broad terms, a Jewish approach to something like the scripture or to something like the tradition of Wolfe deals with angels and demons and aliens in a very Catholic kind of way. And Davidson maybe deals with some of these things differently. So again, this is probably not fair to put you so much on the spot. And if we can just cut this out.
I'll shoot from the hip.
Okay.
So with Wolfe, you get the overarching God's creator, even the evil and fallen angels and evil creatures, those are part of God's creation. And God is working about in a mysterious plan to redeem everyone that can be redeemed. But then you also get things where, the old gods exist. There are creatures that are above us. And Wolfe will say, well, yeah, in the Ten Commandments, there have no other gods before me, but God, the Most High, he's unique. He's not a created being. And there's with Wolfe, you get the interaction of a psychology of a soul going through salvation and working through its sins. And with Davidson, part of that's different because there's not so much a focus on the inward psychology of belief and reconciliation, but there is a community reconciliation where it's like, well, you may not believe this, but you know what? You know how to act and you need to act right. So even if you don't believe in God, that's not an excuse for not acting correctly towards your fellow man. So in some sense, there's kind of that cliche, and I know I'm defaulting back to this, but this cliche where it's like Christianity's concerned with the individual first and then building up, where in Judaism, it's the community, and then the community is what knits all the individuals together.
And then also, which you just said, but I want to reemphasize, there's the Christian emphasis on sustaining of faith and belief and the content of faith and belief. And that's somewhat Catholic, but even more so evangelical, versus the Jewish emphasis on the sustaining of correct practice. And so the orthodoxy versus orthopraxy not being exclusive concerns, but the emphasis being opposite of one another.
And then you get quite a bit of the stories of Davidson's stories revolve around keeping identity in a foreign culture, but then also how to interact in a meaningful way across those separate identities. And then another thing that comes up quite a bit in Davidson's works are characters are condemned by their own words and actions. The example I'm thinking of, but this happens quite a bit, he has a short story, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's about a man who says that a slave can't testify in court, but then there's an accident where he ends up shooting another man because he thinks the man's coming at him to attack him. And the only person that saw that it was in self-defense was the slave. And as soon as he says the slave can say that this was self-defense, he realizes that he's argued that a slave can't testify because he's not free. And so it's the outworking of his own actions or what in his own words or what condemns him. And that comes up quite a bit in Abraham Davidson's stories.
Excellent. Thank you.
I hope that was, I feel like I was kind of shooting from the hip there.
No, I think that that's solid. So obviously much more could be said, but that seems good in broad strokes. So, yeah. All right. So anything else about Captain Roy?
I liked Captain Roy. I would read a book about this character.
I think I would too. I would also read the books by this character, much like with Smoke and Mirror. I think these academic treatises sound interesting. I think Tea Time and the stories of Louisa May Alcott sounds like fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure what interpretation there is there, but I'd be excited to find out about it.
Now that we're done with Bibliomen, I had a few things as the collection as a whole. So Bibliomen is clearly inspired by the Nails song 88 Lines About 44 Women.
Okay.
Oh, you disagree?
I'm not sure what to make of that since I don't know what you're talking about again.
Okay, it's funny, but that's fine.
Okay.
More of this was just a lead in to, I had a couple of dead-end researches with this because I had suggested Miscellany of Men by Chesterton.
Yes. And then I read it and it does not seem even remotely connected.
No, I thought it was something else. I started reading 3 Lives by Gertrude Stein.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't really seem to have a lot of overlap. Part of it was it's 3 Lives, but then it was the spinning Jenny, Bibliomen, was attached there. So I thought that maybe it was relevant. It didn't really seem to be. So I was somewhat irritated because I kind of went down several paths that were not as relevant.
Yeah. So then, speaking of being irritated, no, happily irritated, because I would never have known this, but I got a message on Reddit from our serious fiction, and he mentioned Marcel Schwab's Imaginary Lives, and I had never heard of it, but it was apparently Schwab, so not just Imaginary Lives, but Schwab's work was apparently a huge influence on Jorge Luis Borges. And so then I ordered a copy of Imaginary Lives and read it, and it very much seems to have been an inspiration for Bibliomen. So not in the sense where you could, I don't know, maybe someone who is a better scholar than I am could go through and draw each of the individual connections, and there may be more cross-pollination here than I realized. It didn't seem to be like, I read through it, very interesting, a series of biographical sketches of actual historical figures, but with semi-fictionalized biographies. So Schwab is identifying real people. In some cases, they're real people that were close to someone that is of historical significance.
Okay.
And sometimes they themselves were of some significant historical moment, but there's not much known about them. And so he fills it in with all kinds of imaginative detail, some of which crosses the boundary of strict realism. So, I read through that. I'm like, oh, yes, this definitely seems to be connected, definitely seems to have been an influence. And part of it is that each of the biographical sketches includes detail that seems to go nowhere or ends in odd way. Like there wasn't an effort to make these super coherent stories or super tidy narrative arcs. There was a lot of open-endedness and confusingness and even some internal contradictions. In that sense, very stylistically, the thread of Schwab to Borges to Wolfe, that seems like a rope or a cable or one of those big chains that they have on aircraft carriers. That's a very strong thread.
Yeah.
But I didn't see this as an intertextual story where Wolfe was incorporating specific characters or elements from Schwab. So,
yeah, that sounds way more relevant than the two paths I went down.
Yeah, and I was just really grateful for the tip because, like I said, I would not have found that on my own, and it didn't revolutionize my understanding of Bibliomen, but it is a solid, inspirational literary connection. And it was also just a fun read. They were interesting characters.
So you would recommend it?
Oh, for sure.
Okay. So I guess just stepping back from Bibliomen for a moment. So I found a advertisement from Crank number 5, 1995. It says, Gene Wolfe, Bibliomen, 22 characters in search of a book, winner of the Death Realm Award for Best Collection. Not quite a collection of stories, more than character sketches, an interconnected series of vignettes focusing on individual characters, all of whom are, quote, book people. Readers, publishers, collectors, librarians. Unusual in form and content. They have become detached from the books they belong to. That's the advertisement there. But I guess my question is, who do you think Bibliomen was written for?
Gene Wolfe.
Oh, okay. I'll accept that as an answer. Which people other than Gene Wolfe? Okay, I get why you answered that. It's clearly, it has a lot of in-jokes.
Yes.
It's attached in some way to the Peace universe, the Peace book, and is, depending on your reading, is likely a forgery of one of the characters inside that universe. But I guess my question is, who do you think should pick up this book? What would be a good fit?
Okay, well, first of all, caveat, it's not readily available and it's expensive and hasn't been reprinted for a long time. If you want to pick it up, it might be difficult to pick it up. I think it is for people who enjoy the book life, the book world, as well as fans of Gene Wolfe. I think if you were not a Wolfe reader and you just love the world of books, you would very much enjoy this book. You might not know quite what to make of it, especially if you get it in the Cheap Street limited edition, which is ornate and gorgeous. And it's almost overdone because it doesn't seem substantial as a classic or something of literary significance. But it's surprisingly rich, I think. Taking it as we did, one character at a time, reading through it the first time together as we are recording. It's definitely a book to read and then to reread. And I think the pleasures of it are multiple. So I enjoy the clever jokes, the Wolfian puns, the little twists and turns within the stories. I enjoy the surprises of interconnections between the different stories. But I also just enjoy the aesthetic reality of a book. And this is why it 100% makes sense that it was originally released in this ornate edition, because a book has a physical presence in the world and it has weight and it has texture and has a smell. preferably a good one if it's from a non-smoking household. And then that whole experience of holding a book and reading a book, of looking for a book, of stumbling across a book in a used bookstore or at a jumble sale or something and being surprised by its beauty or depth or complexity. I don't even know how many stories I have of times I have stumbled across a book that I wasn't looking for, or finally found one that I was looking for, or found an additional copy of something that I already know and love, but then it's this exquisitely beautiful text, or picked something up, didn't think anything of it, opened it up and started reading it and had my life changed by it. And that whole complex of experiences is, I think, what Wolfe is celebrating, or a big part of what Wolfe is celebrating, and a big part of what makes reading this so much fun.
Yeah.
Is that?
No, I agree, and I like that answer.
Do I need to go read some erotic poetry about books from Bishop?
It's not a bad book.
I will have to hunt up a first edition.
He just uses a lot of awkward metaphors, so. Yeah. Okay. So we've gone through the whole book now. Did you have any that stood out as favorites? I asked you first, slightly cringing that I think we're going to select the same ones.
This is going to be like lunch, where we order the same thing and then accuse each other of being copycats. Although, to be fair, I like my eggs over easy and you like yours sunny side up. So that's different no matter what. My favorite is Mary Beatrice Smoot Friarly, SPV. She's delightful. Her story's delightful. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, that was the one I wrote down too. There are others in there I enjoyed, but that was the main one that I wrote down. I see why that one was collected in some of the other collections.
Yeah, and has original artwork about it. Yeah, I think it's the most compelling of them.
Oh, yeah, and George Barr, he did the original artwork for that when it was collected in Weird Tales.
Oh, okay.
I didn't even think about that till you mentioned it. So,
yeah. Okay, so Mary Beatrice Smoot.
But overall, I did enjoy this very much. The one with the detective where they're...
Yes.
and, where it's the interview and he's like, oh, yeah, check the date because,
Lieutenant James Ryan O'Murphy.
Mm-hmm.
That one.
Yeah. But then there's also, who's the one that was in the dinosaur folio? Was that French?
Oh, yes, Bernard A. French. I liked that one too.
That one stood out. There's a lot to love in this book. It's odd, but I'm glad I read it.
Yeah, that's how I feel. It is odd. It's not easily categorized, but lots of good things aren't easily categorized.
If you're trying to get a friend interested in Wolfe, I wouldn't hand them this book to start with.
Maybe start with one of his more narratively focused works.
Yeah.
But if you have a friend who is a massive book collector, snob, totally annoying, won't loan their books out to other people, puts all of their dust jackets in Brodarts, obsessively organizes and I'm sorry, I'm just describing us right now. If you have a friend like that and you can scrounge up a copy of the Cheap Street edition and give it to them as a gift, even if they've never heard of Wolfe, they will love it.
No, I agree with that.
The Unreliable Narrators are Amanda Patchen and Brent Towle. And, as Gene Wolfe said, an angel is often only a demon who stands between us and our enemy.